So good afternoon again. Until you get sick of me, let me take this opportunity to introduce the next session. So this is the session on the UN high-level meeting on NCDs, which is in collaboration with the NCD Alliance. So it is my honor to welcome you to this last session of the 10th World Heart Summit. It is also a timely and a vital session as we come together to chart a path towards the 2025 United Nations high-level meeting on the non-communicable diseases. As the world evaluates its progress towards the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, it is becoming painfully clear most countries are not on track to achieve Target 3.4. And while that target rightly focuses on reducing premature mortality from NCDs, it does not capture the full scale of the challenge, nor the full scope of the opportunity. Non-communicable diseases now account for over 43 million deaths every year, with nearly half of them occurring prematurely before the age of 70. These are not just numbers, these are people. Lives cut short, families devastated, futures lost. Ironically, even though we know what works. Since 2018, we have more clarity than ever on affordable, scalable, and cost-effective interventions. What we now need is political will, financial commitment, and system-level action. At the World Heart Federation, we believe that addressing cardiovascular disease should be at the center of any global non-communicable disease response. Why? Because cardiovascular disease remains the single largest contributor to non-communicable disease mortality worldwide. And because the tools to tackle it, like hypertension treatment, tobacco control, and healthier food systems, will yield enormous co-benefits for other diseases and for sustainable development as a whole. That is why today, World Heart Federation is calling on all nations to adopt a bold but achievable commitment to extend hypertension treatment to 500 million more people by 2050. This is not just a goal, it is a global health imperative. And to reach it, we need to invest in primary health care, ensure hypertension is a part of UHC benefit packages, and take strong regulatory action on the commercial drivers of the disease. But we must also look beyond 2030. We must be ambitious in selling a 2050 vision on that one that includes reducing non-communicable disease-related deaths and disability by at least 50% across all age groups, not only those between 30 and 70, because NCDs begin earlier and last longer than we often admitted, and because a healthy life must be a lifelong right, not a midlife privilege. As we move forward toward the United Nations high-level meeting, we must push for a redefinition of success, for counting only lives lost to also preventing lives diminished, from siloed health responses to multi-sectoral collaboration, and from short-term promises to long-term structural transformation. Let today's conversation be a turning point from ambition to action. Thank you. Now, can I invite Dr. Richard Horton, the editor-in-chief of Lancet family of journals. Lancet.
Thank you very much, David. Great. Right. Thank you. Hello, everybody. NCD action in a changing world. What an understatement. I arrived yesterday at Geneva Airport, and I wondered whether I was actually attending the funeral of global health rather than the World Health Assembly. What we need this week is solidarity, hope, and a plan. What is our plan? And that's what you're going to get today from an amazing group of speakers. This year is, without question, the most important year in the history of NCDs since that breakthrough moment, for those of you who were there in New York in 2011 when we got the first political declaration. Now, you've all read, you've done your homework. The zero draft was out last week. What do we think about it? We need to strategize. What is it that we want? We need leadership. What kind of leadership is it that we want? We have to learn the lessons. What are those lessons? The next 5 years. What are the key objectives beyond 2030? What do we want to achieve in the next era of development history? We're going to start off with a fireside chat, although there's no fire, thank goodness. And if there is, then we all need to run like crazy. And our first two speakers involved in conversation is going to be the Right Honourable Helen Clark, former Prime Minister of New Zealand and all-round global health advocate. Helen, please come up on stage. And great pleasure to introduce my friend Sanya Nishtar. Sanya, come up on stage. Sanya, originally from this movement as the founder of Heartfile, but then also held multiple ministerial portfolios in the government of Pakistan, and now is the Venerable Chief Executive Officer for Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. Welcome to Sanya. Okay, microphone, 1, 2, 3. Okay, let's not mince words. It's a mess. No political commitment. No money. We've been pushed off the agenda. What do we do? What are your reflections, Helen?
Where to start?
Right.
Well, my first reflection is that things aren't just going to click back the way they were with some political swing of the pendulum. And countries can't plan in a world like that anyway, where money's here today and it's gone tomorrow. So countries will have to move on. It's not easy to move on when the axe is suddenly dropped on you. I was in Zambia in March, where out of a budget of about 6.4 billion for a population of roughly 20 million, 600 million came from the United States. They had no idea how much of that would stay. About 400 million of it was the PEPFAR-related money, so clearly lives are on the line. So all of a sudden, in very tight budgets in a highly indebted country, you're looking at how do I cover this? So I think, we've got to be solution-focused about the road ahead, and having just been wound up by Tom Frieden on the way in, let me say health taxes are part of the way ahead. Sin taxes are part of the way ahead for domestic resource mobilisation, because we're going to need a lot more of it. What it means for the global health architecture, of course, entirely bigger story. One thing that concerns me, I've said it elsewhere and I'll say it again, is that all of the organisations are under funding pressure. So as everyone rationalises one by one, what's going to slip through the tracks? Are we going to lose stuff because no one organisation thought that was important enough, but actually it was important, but it just didn't have a home and a funding source? So that's a concern.
Thanks, Helen. Sanya, same question. What are your reflections on the current landscape and the implications for the NCD movement?
Well, thank you, Richard, for convening us, and thank you to the World Heart Federation, and wonderful to be back with my NCD family. That's how I started my career. Helen talked about the scale of the disruption, and I'm sure we'll be talking about it all week here. And the stories from the field are heart-wrenching. The scale of the disruption is totally unprecedented. But I want to quote you, Richard. You said 3 things: solidarity, hope, and plan. And you said this is an important year for change. I couldn't agree with you more. The reason being that it is only during a crisis that you can make disruptive change. And I've experienced this firsthand back in my own country, Pakistan. Crisis is a perfect opportunity to go to the whiteboard and to do things with a totally different mindset. And this particular crisis is coupled with, number one, a huge financial crunch, and number two, an overwhelming desire to redraw things with respect to the global health architecture. By the way, I was just at a lunch today and somebody mentioned very rightly, I'm not sure whether we should talk about the global health architecture as being an architecture because it wasn't drawn by an architect, it was a build that is now, that is now disintegrating. And I think this crisis is a moment for us to revisit the duplications, the fragmentation, the mission creep that crept into the system over time. And I think this time round, we need to have a very different vantage point because we have a tendency to start with the organogram. This is how the Gavi organogram looks like. This is how the WHO organogram looks like, and if we have to downscale, these are the kind of things we are going to do. And we do exactly the same in the government system. Here is a ministry X, here is a ministry Y, we are restructuring, this is how we're going to merge, creating a new one. That's not what it matters on the ground. I had this extraordinary privilege of being the Minister of Social Protection where I spent 4 years on the ground, literally on the ground. And we need to start seeing things from the vantage point of a woman who comes either on a bus or on a bull cart with 2 children. She's seen children die with malaria in her village. She's heard about the vaccine. She wants scheme of prophylaxis. She wants to vaccinate her child. She's got an ailing father-in-law who suffers from blood pressure, high blood pressure. She's got a mother-in-law with diabetes, a sibling who requires a crutch, and she herself requires contraception. And when she comes to a primary healthcare facility, she's not interested in who's running Gavi and who's running the Global Fund. And she's not interested in how the vertical programs of the ministries and the different institutions of the government are playing out on the ground and what value all of us bring in our different siloed streams. She wants contraception. She wants the child immunized. She wants a bed net. She wants the kiosk to be there to screen the father-in-law for high blood pressure, dispense thiazides, give some care advice for the diabetic foot she's dealing with, and a kiosk where she could walk away with a wheelchair. And you will remember, Richard, that you and Helen were very kind in giving an endorsement for my last book. Part of what I created was a one-window ecosystem. I think we need to create one-window ecosystems on the ground so that they can truly serve people like that woman. And those women are not just in my country, they're everywhere. I spent a week in Africa last week. In every last mile setting, in every community setting, there are poor women and children and their dependents back home who want services delivered to them in an integrated fashion. And they're not interested to know if I was trained in cardiology and am now working for immunization. They want us to come together to deliver on ground in a coherent way, in a manner in which the governments will take up responsibility over a period of time. And we have the perfect moment to create that new architecture.
Thanks very much, Sanya. And coming from the chief executive of Gavi, one of those important vertical financing mechanisms, I do think that's an important commitment that you're giving. So thank you for that. Helen, I just want to swing back to a point you made in your opening words, and that was about taxes. And we've talked about taxes in halls like this for many, many years, but we haven't been able to move the dial as effectively as we would have liked. Just spend a few moments reflecting on why we've not been successful in being able to introduce taxes that would deliver benefits on NCD prevention, and what needs to shift to make taxation successful. You've got very good experience to share with this audience.
Yes, well, I should say the last time I came to the World Health Assembly, I was the Minister of Health in New Zealand. It was 1990, and we were batting for starting negotiations on the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. So the rest is history 35 years later. But I drove through the New Zealand Parliament what was at the time the world's most forward-leaning smoke-free legislation, and that was always accompanied by very heavy tax on tobacco. New Zealand does tax it heavily. It indexes the tax so it doesn't lose value. And I must say, apart obviously from industry moaning and coming up with ever more creative arguments as to why it's a bad thing, most people don't care about people paying tax on tobacco because most people don't smoke, right? That's been the great achievement. But I think the obstacles lie in a number of areas. So one is industry does campaign against the imposition of the taxes and against any indexation and tries to minimise the level of them. They have budgets which obviously dwarf any of those of NGOs, civil society who are advocating in this area. I was the target of their advertising campaigns in 1990 with smoke-free legislation. I know what it's like to fight these people. And anywhere they see an inroad being made on smoke-free policy, including on taxes, they zero in with the big ad budgets because they don't want more countries setting examples of what can be done to curb smoking. So it's the industry lobbying, and I think exposing and calling that out is very important. But then you've got politicians and decision makers who succumb to industry lobbying. That has to be exposed as well. I remember years ago going to an event at Harvard when I was at UNDP where Julia Frank brought in the finance ministers and said it's a no-brainer. These taxes both will reduce consumption and they'll bring in some useful revenue as well. Although, come the day when we don't collect a cent off tobacco tax because no one smokes, that's got to be the objective. But in the short term, these taxes are going to bring in money that will be very useful for the Treasury. And as Sanya said, in a time of crisis, this is the time to drive forward because countries desperately need more spending for health, given what's happened to the global health funding. So I think it is a special moment for advocacy as to how effective these taxes can be. Now, then the argument will be open as, do you need to hypothecate them, awful word, but do you need to actually tie them to the health budget or to some part of the health budget? I like Tom, am agnostic on this. In New Zealand, all tax money goes into the general pool, it's not tied. But others may find it convenient at this time to say we've just taken a hit to the health budget from offshore funding. Whatever we raise off this will go back into our health system. That's a possible argument. But you've got to get to the ministers of finance because I say with all humility, having been a health minister, I was far from being the most important person in the government. You have to persuade people higher up the chain, which is the finance minister and the president or prime minister, that this is the way to go. But don't you lose this crisis to move forward on the health taxes.
Okay, thank you. I know, Sanya, you have to leave at 4 o'clock. So I want to, before you do go, I want to get both of you, but you first, to reflect a little bit on your experience and lessons from previous UN high-level meetings. Sanya, in your previous roles, you've been part of this movement, as I said earlier. You were there in 2011. You've seen the successes that we've achieved. What lessons would you draw from the high-level meetings you've been involved in and from being a government minister with many different portfolios? To make NCDs count in 2025, what do we have to do?
To make NCDs count in 2025, what do we have to do? That's a very simple question to answer, Richard. I think this is a very different environment than the one in which the previous high-level meetings were navigated. There is a wider context, and I think whatever needs to happen for NCDs cannot be divorced from the wider context. I think the restructuring conversations and how are we going to position NCDs in the restructuring conversations, because I do believe that there is a dimension related to NCD prevention which has to do with the private sector, with private sector engagement. They are part of the problem. They need to be part of the solution. And currently, we're not set up in the institutional architecture to engage them. I'll give you an example of Gavi. We were able to bring down the costs of vaccines from what is $1,000 plus for in an OECD country to vaccinate a child for the basic suite of childhood vaccines, compared to a $25 in a Gavi-supported country. And the reason is because of the active engagement with the private sector through a variety of different instruments. And I think in this bigger discourse, the private sector engagement piece is missing, number one. Secondly, I beg your pardon, not missing, but we'll have to carve out an institutional vehicle to engage with them. Secondly, going back to what I said earlier, I think the imperative to integrate services at the primary healthcare level and to use services that exist today at the last mile and leverage them for cardiovascular disease prevention, for diabetes management is so critical. Immunization is present at the last mile in every country of the world. You may not have a cell phone signal, internet signal, you may not have toilets or water, but you will have a Gavi ice box and a health worker who is trained at the last mile to deliver vaccination. And really, it's an opportunity for us to layer it with opportunistic screening of blood pressure and the other things and health messages. So I think that needs to be factored in very, very concretely. And then the thing that you have been battling, Richard, all your life, the accountability, the concrete, so beyond rhetoric. I mean, political declarations are wonderful documents signaling an intent, but you have to commit to something concrete, measurable results, and you have to have accountability mechanisms to hold us all account for delivery. It is not just governments, it is all of us who have to deliver. And I think the whole discourse on the political declaration has to be in a very new environment with very new innovative tools. And just to go back to what Helen said about the relevance of these taxes that we've been advocating for decades now. Now is the time to push forward. Because yesterday I was at a session with 57 African countries attending, organized by the Africa CDC. The theme was financing sovereignty, health financing sovereignty. There has never been a time like this today, which is why your point about this being a very important year is so salient. Each one of them is talking about vaccine sovereignty, pharmaceutical sovereignty, and each one of them is talking about the need for concrete technical expertise so that they can become self-sufficient in resource mobilization. As I said, I was in Africa last week. I mean, amazing things that are happening. Ghana had a gap of about 150 odd million. They committed to putting those resources themselves. Malawi is increasing its contribution twofold. So there is a will, and I think now is the time to be really forward-looking and innovative. I think this crisis is a moment for change.
Thanks, Danielle. That's great to hear your optimism. Helen?
Well, yeah, we've all been to high-level meetings. Sometimes I think the first in a series gets a lot of excitement, but then you come back to the subsequent iterations over the years and a bit of the oxygen's gone out of them. But perhaps the special context of this year may breathe some more life into this one. And I must say, I was encouraged to see that the first sub-target in the zero draft political declaration focuses on ensuring 80% of countries implement taxes on tobacco, alcohol, and sugar-sweetened beverages at the WHO recommended levels. Now, first challenge is to get it to last beyond a zero draft, right? But, I mean, if you could actually get that through, that's something measurable. You know, if that's the declaration that comes out, you know, then for the advocacy people in public health and civil society around the world, it's something to really be driving at back home. So I think it's getting the target set, so it's not just fudgy declaration that doesn't commit anyone to anything, and then the accountability and follow through from that. I think the benefit of having a high-level meeting is if you can get heads of state and government to go to it, make a speech, and that speech should also be held accountable to later on. But it's the one opportunity really that you get to get their attention focused on it in the global setting, and also hear a little bit about what their peers are doing.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Sanya. It's a good start. Please give our two speakers a big round of applause. Now we're going to go to our panel. So let me please introduce and invite up onto the stage Dr. Wolrd, Senior Advisor for the International Health Policy Foundation in Thailand. Please give them a round of applause as they come up. Tom Frieden, President and CEO of Resolve to Save Lives. Nick Bannett-Vala, who is the head of the Secretariat for the UN Interagency Task Force on Prevention and Control of NCDs. Nupur Lalvani, who's the founder of Blue Circle Diabetes Foundation, and of course our own Katie Dane, who is the CEO of the NCD Alliance. Okay, pick up your microphones. We need you in action here. So let's start off. I'm going to begin with you, Wolrd. Great to have you here. Thailand has been an unfailing leader in many, many dimensions of global health over several decades. You've been an inspiration to many countries. Please give us a little indication about how your government is approaching NCDs in 2025 as we come up to the high-level meeting.
Early this week, I got zero draft of the political declaration text from New York, my colleague from Thai Mission. I have reviewed thoroughly. Nothing new in the text, because nothing new indeed. The issue is on implementation gaps, Richard. The poor governance of most LMIC. A tax officer can be bribed by tobacco, alcohol, SSB industry. Not to increase the tax. If he or she is not bribed, his boss or her boss will be bribed. Health Secretary is bribed. If Health Secretary is not bribed, the minister will be bribed. Therefore, I have a quick review. The cigarette industry is 1.14 trillion industry, with increasing on 2.4% revenue increase. And ends is catching up quickly. Electronic. High-income country has met 75% tax rate as recommended by WHO. It's total tax. Most country has a two tax system, equivalent and specific. 42% of high-income country has achieved that benchmark of 75% retail price as tax. UMIC, 12% of the country has achieved that goal. Low-income country, only 3% of low-income country has achieved that benchmark. Then we are facing the losing war on tobacco. Tom is the main advocate on heart and how tobacco kill. We have to, in the UNGA text, we have to say, tobacco industry is the murder. If you are bold enough, declare that tobacco is murdering the people here. Therefore, I think it's not evidence gaps. It's the evidence implementation gaps, the no-do gaps, how we scale up. I have reviewed thoroughly. There are 57 paragraphs altogether. And of this, 6 paragraphs contain targets and indicators. They ask that by 2030, 80% of member states of UN has increased their tobacco, alcohol, SSB tax. then this is the main issue that you have to fight. The World Heart Federation, World Heart Association may introduce key targets and indicators in addition to the targets and indicators that diplomat upon negotiation in New York has reconciled. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Viraj. And I think that's a brilliant answer and sets up the next question to Tom, which is many political commitments have indeed been made in the past, in 2018. We haven't delivered on those political commitments. The question is why, and what needs to change in 2025 so that those political commitments can be translated into action? Small question.
Well, I just have to say how brilliant Viraj's answer was. It was really perfect in terms of outlining what is happening. And I have a book coming out end of September, and I tell this story related to what he just said. When I became health commissioner in New York City, I had been working on tuberculosis for many, many years, and I said, now my enemy is a real low life form, the tobacco executive. And I got a letter from Philip Morris saying, I still have the letter actually, saying this is a form of hate speech. No individual should be described as less than human. And so next time I gave a public talk, I said, they're absolutely correct. It was wrong of me to say that. I'll stick with absolute objective truth and call them mass murderers. And I never got another letter from Philip Morris. I think ultimately we should never say there's not enough political will. That's a cop-out. We should analyze systematically why things do and don't happen. Who are the winners? Who are the losers? And Dr. Viraj said it very well. It's bribes. It's bribes from the killer industries to the people who make decisions. It's payment of farmers to go grow tobacco when it's not economically viable, but they want a tobacco farmer lobby in the country. It's payment to AstroTurf groups in country to lobby against. It's payment to news entities to cover taxation as if it's a form of extortion. So I think there are many reasons for failure, but the more important is what's the route to success. And I think here we have to think about who are the winners and losers. How do we mitigate the losers and empower the winners? How do we hold those in power accountable? Only 13% of people live in countries where there's adequate tobacco taxation. Any country that doesn't have that is putting the interests of the tobacco industry in front of the interests of their people. And I think where we see progress, it's where you have political leadership from the highest levels of government, competent taxation, because there are complicated issues. As Dr. Viraj said, the specific taxes per stick or per ounce are much more effective at reducing consumption than ad valorem taxes, but need to be indexed to or periodically increased because of inflation. Tax stamps are viciously fought by the merchants of death, but they increase government revenues by 30 to 50%, and they don't cost government a penny. The industry has their own tax stamps. That's a violation of the FCTC. They're not supposed to be involved in self-regulation. We know where that goes. So there are ways the governments to do 4 taxes for 3 wins. Tax tobacco, alcohol, sugary drinks, and junk foods to raise revenue, have healthier people, and lower healthcare costs. But that's going to require mobilizing those who would win from that and mitigating those who would lose, identifying who makes the decision, who can influence them, what are the time frames for progress, what's the budget cycle or the electoral cycle that's going to affect it, and then taking strategic action to make it happen. It's far from a foregone conclusion that will happen. Exactly as Prime Minister Clark said, there are a few dozen people working on this issue from the public health standpoint. There are thousands with unlimited budgets working from the tobacco, alcohol, junk food, and soda industries to block it, because they've said, actually in their own internal and newsletters, this is the biggest threat to our business. Because when all is said and done at these meetings, a whole lot more is said than done. And if you had to say, is there an evidence-based way not to make progress on non-communicable diseases, it would probably have global meetings and resolutions and calls to action. Because you can say they've happened and very little action, but there has been progress in specific areas. Point to 3. Despite the lack of tobacco taxes, there's been huge progress on the other aspects of the WHO Empower strategy. More than 100 countries have implemented programs to go smoke-free, ban marketing, and we've seen a big reduction in smoking globally. We're not using the strongest tool in our toolbox, which is taxation, as much as we should, but even without that, the tobacco industry is on the run. Also, if you look at PM 2.5, another major cause of non-communicable disease, China shows that with commitment, you can make a huge decrease. They have further to go, and other countries need to do more, but it shows what can be done. And in our work at Resolve to Save Lives with the World Health Organization, half of the world is now protected from artificial trans fat. That will prevent nearly 10 million deaths in future years. So with investment of capital, political capital and financial capital, real progress is possible, but we can't be naive about the forces arrayed against us.
Thanks, Tom. And Richard Pito has argued for many years that taxation is a win-win for governments, so why shouldn't they be doing it? And indeed, with governments in real trouble needing fiscal space for their own investments in other parts of health, education, and so on, this is an obvious path for them to take. Now, you mentioned routes for success, and Nick, one of the routes for success, as we've all believed in over many decades, or tried to believe in, and maybe it's been naive of us, but we've really believed in and committed ourselves to the multilateral system. The idea that governments and peoples working together can solve problems together. But we've seen a few grenades thrown into the multilateral system in recent months and indeed years. The Zero Draft was out last week. Tell us a little bit about the role of the UN in the way we think about NCDs in 2025. Does the UN have a place, or is that history?
Okay, well, thanks, Richard. And let me divide this answer into 3. First of all, does it have a role? Yeah, absolutely. Now, we're all here in WHO. We're all health people. But what about the wider UN system? What about the UN Development Programme? It's about governance. I'm going to repeat it several times. NCDs is about governance. What about children? UNICEF, critical role. What about cities where everyone lives these days? UN Habitat. What about people in the workplace? ILO, people migrating, IOM, people who are interested in human rights. That's about OHCHR. And so it goes on. Let's not forget about the WTOs and the WIPOs. So now I want to turn and behave like you. I'm going to ask people in this room, put your hands up here if you are not part of the health sector. If you are not part of the health sector. People in the front look behind. That's pretty pathetic, isn't it? So we have an issue here when we're at these sorts of health events. So now, how are we doing? Well, clearly not well enough. Agencies themselves, the ones I've listed and many others, are still not recognizing this issue as a development issue. It's not a health issue, it's a development issue. Let's talk about alcohol. We all talk about it in terms of health, but actually it's a development issue. Violence against women, against children, so on and so forth. So when you look at all the plans, is it there in the health area? Perhaps. In the broader development areas? Probably not. Look at the plans at the country level, the UN Sustainable Development Cooperation frameworks. We did an analysis recently where we looked at alcohol to see how well reflected that was. Out of 135 sustainable development plans that we looked at, 9, that's 7%, included alcohol. Well, it's supposed to be a development issue, and it's not there. But there is progress because we are seeing NCDs broadly, increasingly on those country plans. So that's good. So it's not all bad news. Let's celebrate and be pleased that we are still seeing that. Now, the third part, plans and opportunities. And you talked about plans earlier. Clearly, we've got the political declaration. Yes, the UN system is in there. We've got to make sure it stays in there, and we need to make sure that there is accountability for the UN system in there. We've got the UN80 reform that's now coming up. We've got to have to do better with less, be more effective and more efficient. So I think there's an opportunity. We've got to work much smarter than we have up till now. We know that the task force has had an evaluation, and we need to learn from that. That's now just on Friday, it was published on the WHO system, so I urge people to look at it. People, particularly people who are involved in negotiating the declaration, look and learn from that. We've got a new strategy we'll be developing in 2026, so we need to make sure we have a plan that is going to deliver on that. And we've got to work with our resident coordinators in the country. And when you speak to them, they say two things. They say, we don't get the supply going because the international community is not asking us to do more. And secondly, they say the demand from the countries they're in is not strong enough. And so they are saying governments, heads of state, ministries of finance, ministries of health, and others need to be asking more. So I would say you've got to be asking and forcing the UN system in country to be doing more. Bring them into the office, sit them down and say, this is not good enough, I want this, this, and this delivered. Just the sort of things that Tom is talking about, but force them to do it.
Fantastic, Nick. Okay, we're in a struggle to protect and defend multilateralism for a new generation. Nupa, I want to turn to you now. You are the founder of the Blue Circle Diabetes Foundation. I think it's fair to say that if one looks across all global health movements, it hasn't been the technocrats who have been responsible for progress. It's been civil society activism that's driven progress. Tell us a little bit about your thoughts regarding the role of organizations like the one you founded and other community groups in NCDs for driving progress forward in 2025.
Thank you, Richard. And the voices of people with lived experience and the voices of communities are non-negotiable, like you just mentioned. And I'm sure all our friends here in the audience will agree with us that there's nothing about us without us. People need to be included in decisions that are made about their health and their bodies. I think that, including people with lived experience is definitely a political priority because for any system to be successful, including people right from the stage of planning and, conception right onto evaluation is the only way that a system is going to be successful and that people are really going to engage with it and get the most benefit from it. Communities like ours, patient-led, people-led communities like Blue Circle are sometimes, I think of it as a net, a net that holds people from falling, that stops people from falling, people that fall through the cracks in the health system. And we know there are hundreds and thousands like us that can't make it another day because they didn't get insulin or they didn't get, blood pressure medicines. There are tons of such people, and there are people like, us sitting in this room that are supporting them and that need to be given a voice. It's also very important, I think, that, and we say this at countless, forums, health systems need to be people-centered. You're not just treating a disease, you're treating the person. It's not just one organ in the body or two. It's not just one comorbidity. You're treating the entire person. So I think that there's just no debate about this. People with lived experience definitely need a seat at the table.
Thanks very much, Nupa. Absolutely right, and we'll come back to that later in our conversation. Now, Katie, of all the people in this room, you're probably closest to the process that's got us to this point with the zero draft, and I'm really keen to get your insights into some of the nuances in the zero draft. But we'll come to the zero draft specifically in a moment. You were involved in a meeting in New York, I understand, in May, that was the UN multi-stakeholder hearing on NCDs, and I wondered if you could share some of your insights from that meeting about how we've got to where we've got today and the lessons for going forward from here.
Sure, thanks, Richard. So the multi-stakeholder hearing on NCDs happened on the 2nd of May. It's obviously one of the kind of key preparatory meetings in the lead up to the high-level meeting. I'll organise my kind of comments around three areas. Number one, in terms of what we heard in terms of the geopolitics of the day, things that have already been reflected. Number two, in terms of who was actually in the room. And then number three, in terms of the key messages that we were hearing from the different stakeholders at that hearing. In terms of the geopolitics, I mean, I think it's already been covered well, but it was really a kind of reality check. Being in the UN, talking to ambassadors, talking to permanent missions, the key themes that were coming out from all of those conversations were it's extremely tough in terms of such a polarized debate right now on any topic whatsoever. Extremely difficult to be reaching consensus on anything. They're spread very thin, covering so many different negotiations on different topics. And obviously the US administration is going to be a major challenge, along with other governments that will probably align around the US. So none of that's a surprise, but I think it was a kind of real reality check of what we're up against in terms of this HLM being in 2025 during these challenging times. And I think in terms of the takeaway from that is that, we obviously need to have some very serious health diplomacy in terms of making sure that this HLM results in forward-looking actions and commitments. And I think the strategy has to be that we work and build a really strong coalition of progressive champion governments that are kind of ambitious and want to see that bar being high in terms of the declaration, and really isolating the outliers that we know well in terms of who they are. I think in terms of who is in the room, it's interesting coming from WHO and the World Health Assembly to obviously the UN, which different rules of engagement, right? You had around 500 people in the room. What we heard was around 10% of the delegates were from the alcohol industry. So very much reflecting comments that we've already heard. Industry is out in force. They're seeing this as a threat. They're seeing this as a challenge. They're obviously seeing any reference to taxes, regulation, you name it, as an attack on their bottom line, and they are out there lobbying hard. So, I mean, that was another, recognition and wake-up call for what we're up against. I think on the more positive side, in terms of who was in the room, Richard, you mentioned earlier the importance of solidarity. Really strong civil society voices from global to national to regional. And as Nupur said, I think the big change that we've seen in the NCD community over the last 7, 8, 9 years is the voice of lived experience in youth. Really fantastic advocates around the table, calling for strong actions across the NCD agenda. And then finally, in terms of what was said, again, the solidarity point came out really clear. I think many statements were kind of echoing the 5 priorities that we at NCDA have obviously been pushing around. Going to Tom's point, I mean, this high-level meeting has to be about implementation, a new era of implementation of what works, investment and financing, particularly with a strong call for health taxes, as others have said already. Integration was a real buzzword, going to Sanya's point earlier, about using this as an opportunity, given the landscape, that we absolutely have to link. This is a high-level meeting, and it's not a WHO meeting. We need to make the points of linking NCDs to different parts of the development agenda, as well as within health. And then the final point that came out really, really clearly, again, building on Nupur's point, was this point on community engagement. The importance of making sure that people with lived experience are at the table, the critical role that civil society have to play, and the fact that civil society there to partner with governments to really kind of translate these commitments into action.
Fantastic, Katie. 10% from the alcohol industry in the room should be taken as a sign of success for this movement of ours, to create that fear. So that's why I really emphasize the words struggle. That's what we're in. It's a struggle for success. Now, let's take our level of ambition up a notch. Viraj, you've been part of another process, and I do want to publicly acknowledge the success of this. You were co-chair of the IMB on the pandemic treaty, and we've all got our fingers crossed this week that this is all going to go through. That's remarkable. I think, honestly, if you'd asked me a year ago whether we'd have got to this point, I wouldn't have thought it possible. But thanks to your diplomacy and your ability to navigate some pretty tricky geopolitical challenges, it looks like you've done it. Touch wood. Now, lessons from that experience from NCDs. What are they?
I believe that the transatlantic transcend the discourse come from Geneva to New York next month, for sure. I have reviewed 57 paragraphs. They are technical resolution, the HLM text. no political issue. But I believe that the issue on transfer technology and know-how, which is the key bottleneck in the INB process. The UCM, the unilateral coercive measures that EU and US and many others introduced to a number of countries, Iran, Syria, Russian Federation, etc., will be brought up and discussed again as a political issue. But we have resolved, more or less resolved in the INB. The pandemic agreement tomorrow afternoon in Com A, I believe it will be adopted. And on plenary, on Tuesday morning, it will be adopted on unanimous. I believe that there's no voting two-thirds majority. Keep finger crossed. Then the lesson from the INB negotiation, it has been 3.5 year torturing process. When I am not the co-chair, I'm the vice chair. We have 6 bureau members. Work unitedly. We keep the unity of bureau, despite the fact that we have different opinion, different position. But the bureau text is a compromise text that it can find landing zone. I think the same negotiation mood and discourse will repeat again in New York. I believe that voice of the youth as well as voice of the people affected, as you have said, is so critical. Not unexpectedly, in the COP FCTC, there are many tobacco industry interference through the COP's delegates. It was published in many COP in Moscow, COP in many places. Industry representative, Philip Morris Inc. is Japan Tobacco, British Tobacco. They are there. Masterminding, pay the delegate, pay and host dinner, pay a luxury hotel, etc. I don't think that in New York there is such interference. But the tax issue will be diluted. The tax, which is the heart of the industry, is the most powerful, as Tom has said, the most powerful intervention in bringing down the consumption because of the price elasticity.
Thanks very much, Viraj. So turning to Tom, let's talk about what countries can do specifically. Obviously, we've emphasized at repeated stages taxation, but in addition to taxation, what else can countries do?
You know, I want to give credit to 2 countries in particular that are leaders in 2 of the NCDs. One is Colombia. The idea of a front-of-pack stop sign on food is the only model that has been shown to change consumption. Now, stop signs and Nutri-Scores and ABDC, you know, people don't know what it means. But a mark that says, don't buy this, it makes the companies change what they make, rapid reformulation, and helps consumers make more informed choices. This started in Chile. It was enhanced and refined in Argentina and Mexico and elsewhere. But Colombia is the only country I know of that has said, okay, and if your packaged food has earned one of these black stop signs, these red marks, scarlet letters, if you will, but they're black because that's actually more effective, you're going to be taxed 20%. And so it's combined the most effective nutrition policy we've seen on sodium, sugar, saturated fat. And instead of talking, you know, this clear front of pack tied to taxes give you the 4th real potential: tobacco, alcohol, sugary drinks, and junk food. So I think this is huge. Colombia is the world leader in sodium reduction and nutrition policy. The data is just beginning to come out for the consumption and health, but they're bringing in hundreds of millions of dollars that they didn't have before. And they're seeing rapid reformulation of products and rapid changes in what the market does. And Chile really has the longest data and huge reformulations, almost as some people even argue more powerful than taxation when you have this kind of a stop sign. The other country to highlight is South Korea with the issue of hypertension. Many countries started out at the same rate, 10, 20% hypertension control, and very important you look at this on a community basis, population-wide. And they, with advocacy from civil society, with leadership from government, they're at 60% control. You know, UK is under 35%, despite having a national health service. In the US, we're at 45, 50%, but if you look at Kaiser Permanente, which has a financial model which penalizes them if people have heart attacks, they're at 90%. So if you can internalize the externalities, to be fancy about the economic language, you can get a result, and Korea shows it's possible. High blood pressure is by far the leading cause of death globally. It kills more people than all infectious diseases combined. The Lancet Commission on Hypertension really, in some ways, it is, dollar for dollar, the most neglected condition there is. We looked at global defense, development assistance for health. Less than 1 out of $1,000 has been going into hypertension control, despite it being killing more than 10 million people a year, and at a younger age than people who died from COVID. So I think the progress we've seen in country comes from the winning triad of a committed government with, as in Thailand, you had people within the government who were reformers, who were committed, who knew how the system worked, and activated civil society with Nupur Lalvani's type group and Katie Dane's consortium of groups that push and support the government, and with rigorous monitoring that keeps everybody on track. Are we making a difference, or are we just passing resolutions and saying we'll do things?
Thanks, Tom. Nick, there's no money. So what do we do?
Well, I do come back to my point earlier that it's not all about money at all, because it's about governance and it's about political will to tackle the private sector, to do many of the interventions that don't cost an awful lot. Having said that, NCDs are going to be with us for a long time. And so governments are going to have to accept that if they want to have populations who are able to work, they're going to have to put money into the primary care system. There's no getting away from it. From where I stand, there's also the need, as it was said very clearly in the World Bank and WHO financing dialogue, not only for increase in domestic financing, but some increase in catalytic funding. So in the UN system, as part of trying to work together rather better, the UNDP and UNICEF and WHO established the Multi-Partner Trust Fund, Health for Life Fund, which is now has been capitalized. We've got about 8 million. It's a lot of money if you're going to use that money to catalyze action. So we need to be really pleased with that. We need to be pleased that actually the people who are putting funds into this are countries such as Mauritius and the Philippines and government of Scotland and the private sector, Lilly Foundation as well. It's not just the big donors as well. That part of that is about building a south-to-south lab to share the experience here. But I would say that this money is most effectively used, small amounts, when you're putting it into the countries to encourage greater fiscal, regulatory, legislative action. And a small amount of money goes an awful long way. So I think that it's about hearts and minds when it comes to resources. Yes, domestic budgets have to be scaled up. Internationally, well-targeted catalytic funds.
Very good. Thanks, Nick. Nupur, going into the high-level meeting in September, what are your asks of governments?
Thank you. This time last year, member states adopted the resolution on social participation, and that will help with the whole of society approach, and that includes communities and people with lived experience as well. We, as communities and people with lived experience, we need to use social participation to advance universal health coverage and NCDs. And my ask is pretty clear. I have three pointers. One, adopt and operationalize the WHO framework for meaningful engagement, because we have existing tools that are available. Second, establish formal participatory mechanisms for people to engage, with member states and with processes. And third, fund civil society-led initiatives. In these polarizing times, there are aid cuts and challenges with funding. And I think some of the most important work is being done by people at the grassroots level, civil society organizations, and they're the first to get cut when it comes to funding. So these are the three things, these are my three asks. Also, I wanted to make a comment on the zero draft, like other colleagues have also mentioned. I think that it lacks references to social participation and community engagement. There is a line on lived experience that is present, but social participation is something that's really lacking. And so I think we need to urge member states to really put down specific, measurable commitments that people can engage, and we can make the most. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nupa. And let's come to Katie to give a view on the zero draft. Reading it when it came out last week, it's very much some positives, some less positive comments. From your point of view, Katie, how do you assess it?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think we're all still chewing it over, aren't we? Because it's only been a few days and we're running into WHA. But I mean, I think before going into the positives and negatives, just in terms of, what does a good declaration look like? I mean, number one, it has to be at the political level. This is a heads of government, heads of state meeting. So the declaration should not be a technical document. It should be a political document. I think it also absolutely has to kind of reflect what's happened over the last 7 years in terms of the evolutions in evidence, in terms of the evolutions in policy. And then thirdly, obviously really making sure that it is actually going to be moving things forward and accelerating action, given that we are off track. We're lagging behind in terms of SDG target 3.4 and all of the WHO NCD targets that are all up for expiry this year. So with that, in terms of what the positives are, I think from our initial reading, one of the positives is that there are actually targets in there. I mean, it's a basic thing, and we can all argue about what the targets are, but we've actually never really had any concrete targets in any UN political declaration on NCDs. And obviously what's in there at the moment is these kind of fast-track targets of 3 times 150 million, focused on tobacco, hypertension treatment, as well as mental health care. And then there's these kind of tracer policy targets throughout, including the health taxes one that's been mentioned. As I say, we can argue about the ambition of them, the focus, but I think we absolutely need to try and keep these targets in because it adds to the kind of strength and accountability of the document. Number two, in terms of a positive, I would say, that the whole point of high-level meetings is to take it beyond being a health issue into being a development issue. I think it does do a good job to an extent of giving a nod to the links between humanitarian, UHC, pandemics, climate change, AMR, all of the things that have happened in the last 7 years of linking NCDs to these other parts of the development agenda. The other real positive that really came out as well at the hearing was the fact that mental health is really broken through. It's part of the NCD agenda, and it's really integrated throughout the document, which is a real, is an excellent thing. I'd say on the flip side, what hasn't come through as the other part of the 5x5 is air pollution, as Tom was saying. I mean, at the moment, air pollution is in there, but it's a little bit wiffly-woffly, needs to be much more focused. And then we've talked a lot about taxes and the fact that there is a section on financing. I'm sure we can all agree that it needs to be strengthened, including there's a great target in there around mental health financing, global average of 2 to 5% of public budgets going to mental health, which is a really good start. I would say we need to be building that out to include a broader NCD target around financing as well. What needs strengthening or is missing? I think it's very odd that it actually barely even references any of the kind of key preparatory meetings that have fed into this high-level meeting. The SIDS Bridgetown Declaration, the Humanitarian and NCDs meeting, the oral health one in Bangkok that happened at the end of last year. That all needs to be recognized because those are already pre-negotiated documents and declarations that governments have already agreed. Really good starting point for this. Completely agree with Nupur's point on the lack of community engagement. That was a real kick in the face. I mean, I think, the hearing kind of came out loud and clear of the need for lived experience and the role of civil society. Pretty weak on that front. And then I would also say it kind of builds on this kind of point that we've been discussing around industry. I mean, at the moment in the declaration, what you can see is a strong focus on the social determinants of NCDs, really, really important. absolutely nothing really on the commercial determinants and the impact that industry interference is happening in most countries around the world in terms of watering down the public health policies that we need in terms of reducing prevention, in terms of prevention. The final thing, I know that we don't like talking about high-level meetings for another high-level meeting's sake. However, the declaration at the moment calls for the next high-level meeting to be in 2031. So we're looking at kind of 6 years down the road. This is what happened last time around, 2018, it was then 2025, 7 years from the next one. It's just too long. Given the scale of the emergency, the urgency around NCDs, they need to be more often, something like 4 to 5 years, to really keep the momentum going and to be reviewing progress and checking where we need to be changing tack.
Thanks very much, Katie. Please give our panel a big round of applause. And to conclude our session, it's a great privilege for me to introduce the president of the NCD Alliance, Leslie Ray-Farrap. Leslie, please, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Richard, for the introduction and the excellent moderation. I had put in my notes, thank you so much for summarizing everything, and now I don't have to. But I understand that we're running out of time here. So I just want to thank you again, Richard, for the moderation. And on behalf of the NCD Alliance, I would like to thank once again our wonderful panel. I know that I was getting a little bit sleepy with the jet lag, and I couldn't stop listening. I found it so interesting. So thank you all for your incredible insights and expertise. And a big thank you to WHF, the World Heart Federation, for co-hosting this last session of the World Heart Summit with the NCD Alliance. I just started my term as president of the NCDA about 2 weeks ago now, I think, so I'm very honored to be up here and start my term at this incredible side event during the World Heart Summit, during a really exciting week and an important week at the World Health Assembly, and for this year as we lead up to the high-level meeting. Lots of big takeaways, as I said, after the discussion. I feel like my head's kind of spinning here, and a lot of next steps that'll lead us to the high-level meeting. And I know that a lot of it will add some momentum to our call for action in our 5 priority areas: implementation, financing, integration, communities, and accountability. I know I've said those at least 100 times already, so I'm hoping that we all know those in our sleep now. A few little takeaways I just wanted to highlight, things that came up a lot and kind of resonated with me in my job also in tobacco control, is the taxation piece. And I think Helen said it, and we've heard it again here, how much more advocacy we can do on that. It's a win-win-win-win. It's a no-brainer, and I think we have to be drilling that into everyone's minds constantly. The health harming industry is our biggest enemy. They have no place in policymaking and no place and no seat at the table. That's something I think that we need to be talking more about too, and we witnessed it at the hearing, so kind of a message to drill home there. And also that people with lived experience absolutely need a seat at the table. And that's something else that we need to continue to drill home. Have our work cut out, but I'm feeling very optimistic, just like Katie, and I think collectively together, we are gonna get to where we need to be. It's exciting to see that this week at the WHA, there's a lot of focus around NCDs. There's a high-level meeting on the agenda as well, various different resolutions, mental health, cervical cancer, and kidney health, all which are big priorities for us in the NCD response. So I think there's a lot to look forward to this week. And I am pleased to share that today's discussion will be continued. I'm just going to check my notes so I don't send you all to the wrong place. Wednesday, May 21st at 6 p.m. at the UN Palais. There will be a follow-up kind of discussion being co-hosted by Barbados, Norway, Spain, United for Global Mental Health, and NCDA. So please join that side event. You're all welcome, and they will be able to continue those discussions there. So before I hand it over to the closing of the summit, I just wanted to thank everyone once again for their commitment, their energy, their dedication, and their passion for NCDs. And I look forward to continuing our collaboration together against NCDs and the road to the HLM and beyond, because the time to lead on NCDs is now. Thank you, everyone.